There's been a few systematic reviews on this that take a look at all the epidemiological research that's been done. First, when you look at adults in terms of gameplay, so match play, the highest concussion-related sport is men's rugby. And the way that they judge this is based on what's called athletic exposures. So AE, athletic exposures. And the way that it's done is usually, well, not usually, but the way that it's done is an athletic exposure is one athlete participating in either one game or one practice. So that one athlete is one athlete exposure. And so generally what they do is they'll take the incident rate of concussion based on a number of athlete exposures. So in this particular case, all of these ones look at the number of concussions per 1,000 athlete exposures. So for example, if you have a rugby match, let's say there's 20 players aside, that would constitute 40 athlete exposures in that one game. Does everyone follow me there? Similarly to practice, if you have one team practicing, that would be 20 athlete exposures for that one practice. Okay? So that's athlete exposures. So men's rugby is number one for gameplay, and this was from a systematic review from Prian et al. In 2018, and the number is 3 concussions per 1,000 athlete exposures. The second one was found to be men's American football, and that's 2.5 athlete injuries per 1,000 athlete exposures. Third on the list is women's ice hockey. So women's ice hockey, 2.27 concussions per 1,000 athlete exposures. Men's ice hockey, 1.63 concussions per 1,000 athlete exposure, followed by women's soccer, and then next up is men's soccer. And this is kind of a trend you'll usually see throughout concussion literature, is anytime there's a sport that involves both men and women, the women will tend to have more concussions than the men's side of things. So that's for gameplay. Same systematic review also looked at practices or training, and men's rugby again was the highest on the list for concussion incidents. Interestingly, women's rugby isn't on here, but I don't think it's been included in a lot of studies, and so I think it was excluded from the systematic review itself. So it's probably up there with men's, if not higher than men's, but we don't know. Men's rugby, these numbers are a lot lower than gameplay. So for example, in gameplay, obviously it's 3 injuries per 1,000 athlete exposures. In training, however, it's 0.37 per 1,000 athlete exposures, so significantly less. Next on the list for training was women's ice hockey at 0.31 per 1,000 athlete exposures. Then third was men's American football at 0.3 per 1,000 athlete exposures, then followed by women's soccer, and then fifth was men's ice hockey, and then sixth was men's soccer. So again, you see anytime there's women's and men's together, the women's tend to rank higher than the men's in terms of concussion incidents. Now, there's a couple sports that weren't on this list, and don't think that they're not up there. Number one that should be included is mixed martial arts. So mixed martial arts, and this is looking at only fights. This was looking at fights in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. So it's not very generalizable because we don't know if it's the same rate in other areas. But in Calgary, Alberta, looking at mixed martial arts fights sanctioned by either Calgary or Alberta, the number is 147 concussions per 1,000 athlete exposures. So rugby had an athlete exposure of 3 injuries per 1,000, and this has 147 per 1,000 athlete exposures, which means that an athlete exposure a fight would be 2 athlete exposures. So essentially what this is saying, is to put this another way, is that about 15% of all MMA fights will result in concussion. So that's a huge number. Okay? So I would say that one is top of the list right now. Ozzy rules football. So rugby was 3 injuries per 1,000 athlete exposures. This study here, looking at Ozzy rules football, found that it was 9.5 per 1,000 athlete exposures. Players have a 10% chance per year of getting a concussion. So in Ozzy rules football, about 10% of players are going to get a concussion each year. That's pretty consistent with other sports we've seen at the university level, particularly hockey, football, etc. So that number isn't that far off, but the number of 9.53 per 1,000 athlete exposures is quite a bit higher. So these are usually in adults. This study here was a systematic review that looked at 18 and under, so youth sports. So just to see if it's any different. Number one, again, rugby. 4.18 concussions per 1,000 athlete exposures. Number two was ice hockey at 1.2 concussions per 1,000 athlete exposures. Number three was American football at 0.53. Now, I put a little asterisk on this one because this number is a lot lower than what I've seen in other studies. So they may have just picked or chosen different studies that showed lower incidence rates, but I think football is still up there. Next is lacrosse, men's lacrosse. 5 is soccer, both men's and women's, wrestling, basketball, softball, baseball, cheerleading, and then volleyball. So as you make your way down the list. So top 3, rugby, hockey, football, those tend to always be the top 3 across the board. So that's for youth. Okay? So that's the highest risk sports for concussion.